So this panel this is the second year that we've done a panel in this format. And I think it's probably the one that's going to have the loosest of structures. But essentially what we're going to hear from the three lawmakers that we have assembled is their ideas, their pitches for the next generation of policies that New Hampshire needs in order to achieve its energy goals. And so we'll hear from each of them, but I think also to a certain extent, we're going to have a bit of a conversation about how things are going at the legislature and how it is that we can make progress in the state of New Hampshire, given the political facts on the ground. So without further ado, I will introduce the three speakers, and I think just in terms of logistical ease, we'll simply go from left to right, my left to my right, or from right to left if you're in the audience.
We're going to start down there.
Oh, we're going to start down there. I lied. We're going to go from right to left. And we're going to start with the chair of the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, who is Michael Vose. Following that is the senior Democrat on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, Kat McGhee, and Senator Waters, who's the sort of dean of the energy scene in the New Hampshire Senate and is on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So if you could pass the microphone down to Mr. Vose, I think he's going to take us off.
Michael.
On, I guess, right? You can hear me? Well, good morning, everybody. Great to see you all here. And I'm pleased to be on this panel. I really appreciate Clean Energy New Hampshire inviting me to speak this morning. Appreciate that, Sam. And I look forward to your questions and our conversation here this morning. So I just want to start out by talking a little bit about what we accomplished over the course of the last year and what we hope to accomplish in the coming year. So the big accomplishment of the last year, which is an ongoing effort over the last 3 years, is reform of the Site Evaluation Committee. We got something done this year with House Bill 281, where we handed off to the Department of Energy the enforcement of site certificate compliance. That was huge because the Site Evaluation Committee itself just didn't have the staff or the funding to adequately handle enforcement. It's a big change. The Department of Energy has staff, they have funding to take on this responsibility. And that was a big step forward. But it wasn't all that needs to be done. As many of you know, I filed House Bill 609 last year that did a top-to-bottom reform of the Site Evaluation Committee. That bill ran into a few roadblocks. Part of it, however, was extracted and put into House Bill 281, and that's the part that we passed already. That's been signed into law. But that didn't stop the process. We've been meeting this fall on retained House Bill 609, and next Monday we will vote on an amendment that brings forward even more changes to the Site Evaluation Committee. Among those changes are it reduces the size of the Site Evaluation Committee from 9 members down to 5. Those 5 people will be the 3 PUC commissioners, the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Services, and a public member appointed by the governor and approved by the council, executive council. In addition, it transforms the administrator of the Site Evaluation Committee into a Public Utilities Commission employee who will be a float employee, and he will be funded by the Public Utilities Commission. His priority will be Site Evaluation Committee duties, but when he's not performing those duties, he can perform Public Utilities Commission duties alternatively. That takes care of a huge part of the funding problem with the Site Evaluation Committee, and that is a huge accomplishment, I think, if we can get this legislation passed into law. So that will be the next big step. Let's finish site evaluation committee reforms, get that done, and then we can move forward. So the challenges that I personally will be looking at over the coming year, number one challenge is reliability of our energy supply. As you all know, we've had a couple of challenges over the last couple of winters where we've come close to some rolling blackouts because of a lack of power in extreme weather, cold weather events. And this is an ongoing problem. And to my mind, when I talk to my constituents, everybody, of course, complains about the price of electricity. But what people really get upset about is when their electricity isn't there, when it goes away. That's what they really get upset about. I get a lot of phone calls from people. My power went out again. What are you going to do about it? So reliability is a huge issue for me. Robert Bryce has written that electricity is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy. It is also the most difficult form of energy to supply reliably. This is a huge problem that we have to constantly be vigilant about. And here's one of the issues that's going to be most difficult to resolve. NERC, the North American Reliability Commission, which is part of FERC, and their main charge is to pay attention to the reliability of our grid, has said recently in a report they issue every August that the U.S. electric grid is on the verge of an electricity crisis due to the premature retirements of our dispatchable thermal power plants fueled by coal and natural gas, and massive increases in the deployment of intermittent wind and solar resources. When FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, met recently and testified before the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Willie Phillips, one of the commissioners, told the senators, quote, "We face unprecedented challenges to the reliability of our nation's electric system." FERC Commissioner Mark Christie echoed those warnings, saying, quote, that the electric grid is heading for a very catastrophic situation in terms of reliability. And Commissioner James Danley said, quote, "There's a looming reliability crisis in our electricity markets," saying that federal subsidies designed to promote the deployment of non-dispatchable wind and solar assets are causing reliability issues because those subsidies are helping to drive fossil fuel generators out of business. So what are we going to do about that? At the state level, there's not a whole lot we can do since we're in a regional grid. But there are a few things we can look at. And I've filed legislation that we'll be discussing this coming session to look at what we can do to sustain our existing resources, particularly the Seabrook nuclear power plant. So I'm going to start a conversation this year about changing our renewable portfolio standard to a clean energy portfolio standard that tries to incorporate ways to support other kinds of baseload energy in particular, to make sure that we don't lose resources that provide reliability to our grid. In addition to that, I filed a separate piece of legislation to assert our state's sovereignty when it comes to protecting the health and safety of our citizens, especially when it comes to energy resources. I'm calling it the New Hampshire Energy Independence Act, and it will give us the opportunity to protect our state's resources to the degree that we can, living in a country that is based on federalism. So those are conversations that I look forward to having over the next few months as the legislature gets back to work in session. And I'm sure my colleague on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee wants to talk a little bit about some other initiatives that we have going on. So I'm going to cut it off there, and we'll talk about, I'm sure, during the Q&A portion of this session, some challenges that we face in the EV market, in the offshore wind market. But right now I'm going to cut myself short and move on.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It looks like the room has filled up, which is always fun, and it may get warm, but hopefully it'll be worth your time. My name again is Kat McGhee. I'm in my third term on Science, Technology, and Energy as the ranking Democrat. And in addition to what Michael had to say about accomplishments from last year, I guess I wanted to chronicle a little bit of what we've tried to do and where we've sort of fallen short in being able to pass legislation that we thought would be helpful for the state. The mechanisms that we have as a state in order to bring about change are consistent no matter what state you're in. You can have policies that affect the supply. You can have policies that affect the demand side of the equation, like demand response, which was just discussed in the keynote, and also innovation. Right, the VPPs would be an example of an innovation that would help us to pull together greater reliability out of a distributed grid. And I think where we're in a transition, we're trying to figure out what the landscape's going to look like in the future. It's hard to have the conversations at times in our committee and elsewhere about what does it look like, what do we move towards, what do we need. And so those, we're constantly grappling back and forth with those conversations. And also the push-pull between different viewpoints in terms of what should we be doing on energy. I've seen a lot of conversation about all of the above strategies. At this point, I would prefer an all of the above strategy for clean sources. I think that not having clean in the definitions has been part of the problem in a lot of the decisions that we've made, and we will be moving down the road with the results of those decisions towards perhaps more expensive solutions because we weren't taking our responsibility as seriously as we could earlier in the process. That's just my perspective. So we have supply and demand. We have our energy efficiency efforts through New Hampshire Saves, which have been a little bit of a ping-ponging effect in the state. We used to all agree that energy efficiency was the no-brainer, if you will, in terms of energy, that the negawatt is the least expensive watt that we have, and that the return on investment for energy efficiency in lowering our demand for imported energy would be a good deal for people in New Hampshire. So we are still, trying to push that forward, and we've worked on several bills to support energy efficiency. One of the bills that I put in this year was to try and, we had 3 bills actually, to look at increasing the amount of regional greenhouse gas initiative funding that was actually used for energy efficiency and or innovation in sustainable energy in the state. There are a lot of different programs that we could be instituting, and we often look at other states in terms of what's been adopted, what's working well, to try and figure out where dollars could go and best be used. For example, in this state, we have a very high dependence for home heating, oil and gas. So our housing sector is a place where we use a lot of imported fuels, where we could create programs that would assist folks in lowering those costs and converting But then again, you're going to be increasing your electric demand, right? So where I was going with sort of all of this is that we have a number of excellent bills that individually make sense. But I would prefer us to not have a scattershot approach to why we're doing what we're doing. I would prefer that we returned to an approach of having a climate action plan that basically tells us what we're doing in each sector, where we're going, so that businesses have the security of understanding what the state actually supports, rather than it being, rolling the dice and waiting until the end of the session to see if a bill makes it over the finish line. I think those kinds of practices are more costly. Now, we will have a climate action plan coming out of the Department of Environmental Services, and many of the people in this room are aware of that and will understand that that's happening. And that's because there are federal dollars that are tied to the fact that the state have a climate action plan. So that plan is due to the feds next March. And I think the Department of Environmental Services is working really hard to try and pull that together. And it will be interesting for us to see what's in that plan, because we put in a bill asking that the state have a plan in the House for each of the last several sessions, and we've, not had any success in arguing that maybe we should know what we're doing before we put energy policies out there. So the last thing I'll say is another bill that I prompted in the House was a voluntary smart meters program. We've heard sort of through the grapevine that our largest utility provider is maybe looking at converting to smart meters by 2030 or so. And this bill didn't want to make a mandate. They don't go over very well here. So this bill basically said people should be able to buy a smart meter that will take them into the future if they choose to upgrade their infrastructure. And that will help to be a catalyst for the infrastructure starting to be converted. And then, when the conversion happens, it will be less of a nut to crack in terms of money that will go back to the ratepayers to reimburse the company for, because that would be a capital investment in infrastructure that we would be responsible for. So we tried to get that going. That is still in our retained bill hearing that will be heard on Monday. I still hope that goes through, because I think that unless the legislature is there to spur the utilities to pursue innovation, if we're not guiding that discussion, it will happen in their time frame and not a time frame that maybe is best for the New Hampshire consumer. So let me look on my little list here of all the things that were our priorities in my caucus on ST&E. I started to say increasing money from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative towards projects that would help the state go forward in lowering its demand. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, as many of you know, is a regional cap and trade program that we're a party to. We've had hundreds of millions of dollars at this point come into the state, and many of the states in RGGI have been using upwards of 80% of that money, if not more, to do the things that the program was designed to do, which is give states capital they wouldn't otherwise have to raise through taxes in order to invest in the programs that they see fit. And unfortunately, our state has seen fit to take the first dollar of the auction prices and put that into our energy efficiency programs, and then the rest of the money goes back in rebates over a 12-month period. So we've been using about 3% of the money and rebating 97%. And what I will say about that is, I know the argument has been, well, we want people to have more money, right? We want to lower people's bills, right? Which is a good goal, especially since what we saw last year with rates. But I don't think anybody noticed last year that they were getting that money, cents per bill times 12 months. Last year alone, about $40 million went back in ratepayer rebates from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. And that was money that we did not get to invest, which could have compounded and become more money for savings in the state. So for me, it's a question of looking for more strategic perspectives around how we approach energy savings for people. Not saying that we don't have a role to play or we can't do anything about it, but saying what are the biggest bangs for the buck, what are the things that we should be doing, what can we align around in terms of energy policy. So I guess I'll leave it there, and I'll hand it over to my esteemed colleague from the Senate, Senator Waters.
Thank you, Kat, and thanks to Sam, Clean Energy New Hampshire, Calpine, and all the other sponsors. What a great turnout today. And I just wanted to pause and say that I hope you look up here and see an example of the bipartisanship that works in our legislature. We got a lot done last year and over the last few years, and because of the working partnership of my House colleagues and then with us in the Senate, and certainly going to mention the chair of our Senate committee, Senator Avard, but Senator Bradley's always there, Senator Perkins-Cuoco, so it's just an awfully good example of what bipartisan work can do in these divided times. And now I will say, Sam, that when you say at the start of this thing that we're supposed to shift from muddling to visioning, and I've always considered myself to be kind of muddling waters. I try to do a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And, if you want the vision thing from me, my vision of politics would be something out of Hieronymus Bosch, and my vision of climate change would be the martyrdom of St. Lawrence. Go check it out, okay? And, so I do think that what we've shown the last few years is that you build a stone fence one rock at a time. And really kudos to my House colleagues, Michael, House Bill 609, and it took a couple of years, but getting us there is, I think, really important for doing what we need to do to make sure we get the energy supplies and the transmission in the state that we're going to need, and we're going to have a better process. So on the big picture, just a couple of things. In terms of the climate action plan, which Kat described, we've got $3 million to do that. There's no mandate in there about renewable energy commitments. However, it is supposed to be all about mitigation. What do we do to mitigate what's happening to the environment through changes in energy policy? So that may be a backdoor way for New Hampshire to start teeing up what we could do with more emphasis on renewable energies. I will say also the big thing that's coming for New Hampshire is offshore wind. We had the release of the final maps for the Gulf of Maine, 3 to 3.5 gigawatts developed out there, floating offshore wind. And let me mention the Normandale report, which is the assessment that Governor Sununu ordered by executive order, and it has just been released last week. It's 600 pages. You can find it on the Department of Energy website, and really worth a read, particularly for the sections on energy supply, the implications for New England and for New Hampshire, and transmission. And whatever source of energy, the picture that is given there and the research behind it is really valuable for us. Also, we just heard about the Twin States project, getting some of that billion or $1.4 billion of federal funding. And Twin State is a fabulous project, bringing about gigawatt of Quebec hydro, but it's bidirectional. So let's combine that with onshoring offshore wind power, and you start to look at something that can shave peak, or actually will create a virtual storage system of a lot of energy so that we can regulate our energy supply. So this is great. And then plus the IRA, how many hundreds of billions of dollars are available there? We passed a good bill last year on hydrogen, and we passed a good bill on grid modernization, and they both tee us up to get some of that funding. Also still from the Infrastructure Act and the Transportation Act. There is funding there for some of the things that are going to help New Hampshire people out, particularly in the EV area as well. So legislation, I think we're always going to do more of the same. We've heard some of the perennial issues that my colleagues have mentioned. And I think we're going to have about 8 or maybe 10 energy bills in the Senate. We've heard about the Site Evaluation Committee. There's a lot of discussion about adding into that House Bill 609, an expedited process for existing energy facilities to expand our same nameplate, expand the nameplate up to 50%, or transition to another energy supply, or expand on an existing site or adjacent property. And so I have a bill that is going to expedite that process for those kind of categories, so that investors can see that it's actually able to get something like that with an existing plan. They don't have to go through every jump, every hoop, every study all over again. So I think that will help us as well and be a kind of an add-on to what is being done in House Bill 609. With Twin States, it looks like in meeting with the NextEra folks that we may have to do some legislative tweaks in terms of siting and interconnection that will help that project do what it's going to do, and so there will be a bill on that. Also, in terms of offshore wind, we may need to do some legislation through a bill this year that we could add an amendment to that might help us further the partnership on transmission with the other New England states. And then seeing how Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut have joined in a procurement consortium, so they're not competing with each other, that it may be in the interest, as Mark Sanborn, kind of his exit interview told me from DES, that we may want to think about some kind of formal partnership with Massachusetts on procurement of offshore wind resources. So we could do something like that. Now, on transmission, we did our grid modernization bill last time, but it looks like, there may be some things we still need to do on interconnection. And Rebecca Perkins-Cuoco will have a bill on interconnection issues. Also, we've heard today in the keynote address a very persuasive argument. And I think the whole thing was set up so Sam could say that sentence, we can't get to VPP without performance-based rates. Was that true, Sam? Well, you had everybody here, and you had her come up so that you could utter that one sentence, right?
She may have convinced me that I needed to utter that sentence.
Well, anyway, so somebody gave me some language around performance-based rates, and I have put that in. And I do think it's true that, we can see that is the next thing to, judge rate making based on what kind of energy efficiencies and what kind of policies related to customers, and obviously with the increase in DERs and other things. Plus, if we don't have that kind of structure set up, it's hard to see how virtual power could work. And both of those, I think, are directions we have to go. So I think there's going to be a possibility to get something passed in that area as well. And we did some good work last year in terms of some steps towards creating a market through time increments for metering, and some of the things we did on storage last time. Community power is coming along like gangbusters. Again, thank you, Calpine, for now you're going to be helping Dover join that coalition. And I think that we'll see some expansion there potentially in some legislation that community power, to clarify that municipal power source and power generation that is used within the community, that they are in fact authorized to do that. And I think that's the next step for community power, is not just going to the marketplace to bid for cheaper power, but also then to start creating generation sources and distributed energy networks. I think if you congregated, and the legislation we did last time on EVs and battery storage said that you could congregate 10, 20, 30,000 EVs in your municipality and use that as a giant battery. So I think these are the kinds of things we're going to see, maybe a little bit of legislation this year, the future. A small thing, I have a bill in on e-bike batteries to make sure the e-bike batteries are under Underwriters Laboratory or otherwise approved because of the fire issue. We had a study committee on EV charging in rental properties, and the report came out from that. There may be a little legislation emerging from the House on what do we do. A lot of work with the fire marshal, and just how do we look at the EV charging, not only so renters have access to it, but we make sure that EV charging is safe. I did want to mention, it's not exactly energy related, but I did mention the climate action plan, which said that's the mitigation, that's the renewable energy goals side. I think we also need to look very comprehensively at what do we do about environmental adaptation, resilience, and innovation. So I have a comprehensive bill that brings together the appropriate state agencies and a few other folks and says we need to do long-range planning. How are we going to adapt to a changing environment? What kind of resilience planning, homeland security, you name it, are we going to need to have? And then what kind of innovation and new jobs might come out of that? Now, you think of a couple things that we're going to have to look at. What if we have to air condition all the schools in the state? Probably don't want to do it by more fossil fuel plants, probably want to do it with heat pumps. But how are we going to pay for it? And what relationship does that have to school building aid? Or another example, with DOT, you know, how many times over in Allsted have we replaced the same culvert and wait for it to blow out again? In the areas of the seacoast, the sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, it's damaging our roads. There's a whole lot of infrastructure that may have to be moved, water treatment plants, you name it along the seacoast. If we see 3 to 5, 6 feet of sea level rise by 2100, which is probably a cautious estimate. And in other parts of the states, well, then agriculture, the cycle of drought and flood is really affecting, and then timber as well, our timber resources, our natural parks, and all of our state buildings, which we're going to have to figure out what to do about extreme precipitation or need for air conditioning and so on. So it kind of is related to energy because what we do on the energy mitigation side will determine how much and how fast we have to do adaptation. And let me just end with one last comment about the bipartisanship here, is that I think that a real fundamental agreement that we came to over the last few years is that, you know, we set policy. And when it comes to the PUC, if they don't fully understand what we do when we pass bills, we'll make sure they understand. And that's what we did. Thank you, Representative Vose, on New Hampshire Saves, and put in a very good framework there. And I'll just say my own perspective is that if PUC somehow in the New Hampshire Saves rulings does not do what we think we told them to do, we can act pretty darn fast and tell them what we want them to do. So I'll stop there, Sam. Thank you.
All right, folks, so I promise we have plenty of time for questions, but because normally in the format in which these lawmakers and myself interact, they get to ask me questions, I cannot resist the opportunity to take the time to ask a few of them before handing it off to you. And what I'll do is I'll disconnect this microphone, I'll start roving the room, and a thing to remember is that we videotape all of these sessions and we put them online afterwards, so please make sure either that you speak into the microphone or make sure that someone repeats it into the microphone for after the fact. So I'd like to start with Representative Vose. You mentioned the sovereignty bill, the grid independence. I'm forgetting the name. It's because we've gone down the line enough. Can you speak more about what that bill is and what it would do?
Yeah, I'm calling it the New Hampshire Energy Independence Act. It might more legitimately be called the New Hampshire Energy Sovereignty Act, because it asserts the sovereignty of the state to act on behalf of its citizens to protect their health, safety, and welfare by preserving energy resources. So, for example, what the bill specifies is that if an existing energy resource is ordered to be closed by a regional or national body, the Department of Energy and the Public Utilities Commission would be instructed to immediately open a docket to determine how that affects the health, safety, and welfare of New Hampshire citizens. And if they determine that the effect of that closure would be negative to the citizens of New Hampshire, the DOE and the PUC can then ask the DOJ, the Department of Justice, to file a lawsuit to protect that energy facility. So that's the essence of what the bill does. It also defines that because it's important to the health, safety, and welfare of all of our citizens, that we use all of the above energy resources to make sure that we have a reliable supply of energy 24/7.
So for instance, if ISO New England, if a power plant were to announce retirement, ISO New England made a determination that that power plant was not required for reliability, then New Hampshire DOE could open a docket to sort of make their own determination to those facts.
If it was ordered by an outside agency, a voluntary retirement on the part of a power generator would be fine. It would be the forced retirement of a power generation facility that the bill would seek to address.
Such as through EPA Clean Air Act requirements or,
Yes.
or similar. Gotcha.
Yes.
Okay. And my second question is about a clean energy standard, which I think we have seen clean energy standards pass in other states that have been more resource neutral than New Hampshire's renewable portfolio standard. I'm curious, is it on the table for that legislation to increase the amount of clean energy that the state of New Hampshire wants to procure as part of that standard, or are we simply changing the definitions of what's clean and what's not?
It probably does a little more than just change the definitions. It adds nuclear. Protecting Seabrook, I think, is an important aspect of what we want, or I would like to see this clean energy standard achieve. I haven't seen actually any legal legislative language from OLS yet. I submitted a request that they draft this bill, but I didn't submit any suggested language. I did suggest that they look at how Maryland, the state of Maryland, changed their RPS to a clean energy standard, but I haven't seen any language yet. I did specify that we did want to protect nuclear energy, and I did specify that there would be some small percentage of megawatt hours from a nuclear energy plant that could be compensated under the clean energy standard. But that percentage is up for debate. And I also specified that it shouldn't increase the total cost of the program. So that would probably require some adjustments to the compensation that other sources receive. But as I said, I don't have details yet because I haven't seen any legislative language from OLS, who I understand is besieged
Swamped.
right now. Swamped.
Yes.
Yeah. So
And I'd also encourage, if you'd like to react to each other and ask each other questions, please feel free. But I do have questions for you, Kat, next whenever you're ready.
May I? I was just going to say, I'm pretty sure that nuclear already has a designation as a clean power source, and I think federally and otherwise it's not considered an emitting source, so it's already in that category. And I think the question becomes, what would adding nuclear do to our renewable portfolio standard in terms of who would get those credits? If there are a limited number of credits, do they all go to the nuclear power plant? And then we no longer have an incentive program for people to be adopting renewables. So there's a lot of questions around what we're trying to achieve with that before we, But I'm sure we'll have those discussions in the hearing rooms. So did you have a question for me?
Yes. So smart meters. Some of the New Hampshire's electric utilities have smart meters already, but what we know is that the meter itself is not a panacea. The data has to go somewhere and be used for something. And in the instance of the New Hampshire Electric Co-op, they actually wound up on a sort of dirty dozen list of utilities that collect data from their customers, but then don't make it available to the customers themselves to use for actionable information on how to reduce their bills. And so opt in for smart meters, great. But then how do we make sure that the data itself becomes accessible and usable given the state of affairs with utility data systems?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it brings me to a point that I wanted to make here today. When I was in my first session, we had a bill that came across from the Senate for a statewide energy data platform. And my background is in software program management, and so in order to represent the bill and manage the subcommittee, I talked with the person who was the brainchild, who was the person who came up with the idea, and had him explain to me what he was trying to do. And what I ran into during that process was an understanding that there are very few people that actually have technology background and understand how important technology is to this transition. And so we did end up getting the bill through the House and over the finish line for the governor's desk. And there was a docket set up over at the PUC, which I followed and as an intervener. And they are now in the RFP process for building an API of APIs that will allow us to insert utility data from all the major utilities into a platform that can then be used to distribute energy data in however you want to slice it. So every time we look at a linchpin technology and how it feeds into the overall, I think what we're trying to do is say, what do we need in our infrastructure in order to support being able to manage the energy in the future? And so when you first have energy data, it's not information. You have to learn how to make it into information. And there are a lot of apps that you can download now that you can pair with your smart meter in order to do all kinds of fun things on a gadget. But I think as a state, what we want to do is really enable the ability to slice and dice our in-state energy data so that we can leverage it for planning, for efficiencies. And so the smart meter piece comes from, again, wanting to sort of spur an effort to just allow people to be able to get on that bandwagon. There are always people who are early adopters, whether it's electric vehicles. So we wanted to leverage the fast, the early adopters and the fast followers and get some of that out of the way. So I don't know if I fully answered your question. That's okay. Peanut gallery.
No, I think well, certainly the data platform could certainly change the landscape with regard to how folks access their own data. So I think you did, yeah.
Okay, great.
So Senator Waters, isn't performance-based rate making great? No, just kidding. Just kidding. So I actually wanted to ask about the interconnection bill that you mentioned. It's not your bill. It sounded like Senator Perkins-Cuoca is submitting it. Can you give us any more detail on that, or do you not have that at the tip of your tongue?
I don't. We talked about what she wanted to look at a bunch of things, and I think that what the bill will end up doing is tasking the grid modification, the grid modernization group that we have set up with additional duties to look at larger interconnection issues, because the one they're looking at right now is what to do if a renewable energy project comes in and there has to be a new substation set up and they pay the $2 million up front, and then the subsequent investor who also wants to do a solar field or something, it's available to them, and is there a way for that initial investor to get that money back? But I think that what Senator Perkins-Cuoca wants to do is to look at, how interconnection in general can be expedited and made more available to distributed energy resources. So that's I think those would be the parameters of it. And I think that she also will have something on, the House Bill 281 with the least cost. We talked a lot about among us at the time, and I've talked since with Senator Perkins-Cuoca, and we decided that if she might try to put something in on that as well, is that what pieces of that body, I think we were convinced that some of it wasn't functioning so much anymore, but some things are probably valuable, and where could that be embedded in statute that that kind of public input would take place. So
And for those,
I can't speak for her, and I know Senator Avard had a couple bills in, but I didn't want to speak to them particularly because they're his bills.
Senator Avard was going to be here today, but was having car trouble, is what I was told.
I wonder.
So-
I thought I was going to see him, but
Yeah. And for those who aren't as intimately aware of the legislative details, House Bill 281 last year repealed the New Hampshire least cost integrated resource planning statute because the language was viewed as archaic, but there was a commitment from Senator Avard to revisit that and try to reintroduce the pieces that were missing. So I am now going to be quiet and hand the microphone over to you all. And in the back of the room, the hand went up very first, so I'm going to pass this one to Bill Baber to start. And it is very warm in here.
Thank you, Sam. So one of the issues that never seems to get a lot of attention in the state, in fact, no attention, as far as I could tell, is one of the major residential consuming energy points in the state, and that's rental housing. Rental housing now is the fastest growing part of the housing market. For urban areas like Dover, where I live, it's about 60% of our marketplace. And yet we want everyone to be saving energy. We want more distributed energy, but this is a market that has no incentive to do that. Landlords aren't incented to do it because they don't get any benefit from it because they're not paying the utility bills. Utility bill payers are renting. They don't want to invest in something. What is the legislature going to do about this ongoing problem?
well, I'll talk to that a little bit. I do think we have made some good progress on low-income solar, and the capacity for those programs to aggregate rate holders, consumers, so that they can get the benefits of the program, and most of them are renters. So I think that is a vehicle to get at this issue. And Bill, you'd be the best one to correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Dover has some mandates now on EV infrastructure readiness for apartment complexes. I think the bigger issue here is going to be whether through the vehicle of community power, there might be a way to provide the kind of incentives you're talking about. Based on my conversations in the EV renters committee we had this summer, I think that the legislature is always going to be pretty loath to pass mandates that affect municipalities and individual developers and builders. So I think it's a real problem, but I'm not really sure legislatively what we can do, although perhaps my colleagues will have a better sense of it.
Just passing that mic rapidly. There isn't anything that I've seen that anyone's putting in terms of that particular issue, Bill. But I will say that we hear a lot of conversation about the dearth of units that we have, or the lack of capacity that we have for housing and affordable housing in the state, and how it's having impact on other state issues like workforce issues, people being able to locate here for work here. And I think that there's probably a great synergy that can be had there if we could be a little visionary around building new housing and making sure that that housing is also sustainable and connected. I know we saw some great ideas about, networked ground source heat communities, right? The idea of that. So there are many innovative ideas, and what's difficult in the legislature is not only discussing solutions to the ideas at hand, but also figuring out how to fund them, which is another reason that we had 3 bills trying to take some of the Reggie money and put it into funding so that we would have sources for money to conduct programs that would assist in some of these areas, right? I know one of my colleagues, Representative McWilliams, is putting in a bill for cash on the hoods, right, for a program to help people purchase EVs, so state in addition to federal funding. And also looking at larger parking lots and requiring them to put in, solar capacity, right, leveraging those spaces. There are so many things we can do, but I think first we have to have the discussion around which issues we're solving. So you're bringing up one of the issues that needs to be solved. And I think we need to have more fulsome conversations around what the options are at this point. And I don't think those conversations, we all talk to each other about what we're doing and what we're trying to get across the finish line, but in my humble opinion, we're not ambitious enough. Not that we want to change the character of New Hampshire by trying to mandate how people have to move forward, but even when we have things that are optional, if they can't get passed into law, then we have to really ask how far behind do we want to be.
It's nice to see you again, former Representative Baber. I would just throw out a word of caution that we have to be careful that we don't put the cart before the horse. There's infrastructure changes that may be required before we rush headlong into trying to solve problems like the one you described. For example, I was at a meeting last week with the state fire marshal, the chief of the Kensington Fire Department, East Kensington, or Kingston, I guess it is, Kingston Fire Department, and gubernatorial candidate Kelly Ayotte was there, and these firemen were expressing to us their concern about, even though EV car fires don't happen that often, when they do happen, they suck up a lot of resources. The chiefs were telling us that fighting an EV car fire can take 8 or 9 hours and 100,000 gallons of water, whereas fighting a regular car fire only takes 2 hours and takes about 10,000 gallons of water. So they were asking us, well, what are we going to do if half of our fire department and half of our fire equipment is off fighting a fire for 8 or 9 hours? How are we going to cover the rest of our community? And that's an infrastructure issue that we have to think about before we rush headlong into trying to come up with innovative solutions for some of the problems like the one you described. So I just want to let everybody know that these are complicated issues. There's not a simple and quick solution to them.
So I'm going to try to sprinkle my answers around the room here, but as I walk back here, I'm going to note there is federal money for low-income solar coming to the state, as well as the Homes and Hero program that are supposed to be for low-income folks as well.
Hi. First, I will say I am here to learn. My name is Jessica. I live on the seacoast in Portsmouth. And I would just be interested in hearing each of your definitions of clean or renewable energy. The reason I ask this question is I'm very invested in the plastic issue, and I know there is an industry push to make chemical recycling or advanced recycling a way to address our plastic crisis. And my understanding is that a lot of our neighboring states have kind of closed the door on the possibility for these facilities to show up there as a way of burning plastic to create energy. And New Hampshire has yet to do that. So I would just be interested to hear how you define clean or renewable energy in these upcoming bills.
Again, they defer to me. Well, I think most of the plastics bills in the House anyway don't come to our committee. However, in terms of clean energy, my definition would be non-emitting in terms of carbon emissions, which is the problem that we're facing in terms of warming that we're trying to address by our energy policies. So clean would be non-emitting sources. And renewable energy is generally energy that doesn't require an outside fuel source to be brought in. So that's that's the simple. No.
You got it.
Okay. All right.
Okay. This gentleman has hand up very quickly each time.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Wharton Sinkler from the Sandwich Energy Committee, and I've heard a lot about the tension between reliability on the one hand and the imperative, and it is an imperative, to reduce our emissions in line with the threat of climate change. One of the solutions, obviously, is going to be moving energy more easily from place to place. There is a bill in the U.S. Senate right now called the Big Wires Act that would create more transmission between regions in the United States. So that would be on top of the recent Twin States funding, which we just heard about. So how important could that be towards reconciling those two needs that are in tension, the reliability and the imperative to stop emitting? Thank you.
I suspect Chairman Vose has something to say about it too, but I think there's several components about this. In terms of reliability, yes, we need enhanced transmission. That's what the IRA recognizes, and there's so much money coming into that. I'm really glad Twin States got some of this first round of funding because it's a good example, but there's much more funding in that program that's going to be coming down. Resilience, though, and reliability also really have to, be part of bringing in new resources. This is why offshore wind is just crucial. As far as Seabrook goes, the license goes to 2050. I think the Normando report suggests that it probably better be kept in operation, get another renewal for 35 years after that, and unless the concrete really deteriorates or in a way they can't fix it, we should make sure we have that. But we need more energy sources, whether it's Hydro-Quebec or whether it's offshore wind. Now, in terms of the transmission, I'm really very interested in this consortium that's been set up to deal with the kind of a trunk line transmission for offshore wind, so that we can move the resources from northern New England to southern New England, southern New England, northern New England, and then since so much else is being developed on the mid-Atlantic coast and down to Virginia, maybe even to North Carolina, there might be more agreements about moving power in broader regions. But the picture you paint is exactly right. The last thing I'll say is that if we want to do something about resilience and reliability, let's do something about energy efficiency and peak shaving. Because we heard in the presentation this morning, and the utilities say too, if we can, the peak is moving, the duck curve is moving, and the winter peaks and the time of day and all that is shifting around. But the one thing we can do, if we can do peak shaving with a lot of these other technologies and the virtual grids, the EVs, whatever, it really does help us address that. The last thing I'll say is this, that there are reports that 80% of what is in IRA funding for renewable energy can't really be unlocked unless we have adequate transmission. And we don't have adequate transmission, and it really is a big flashing warning sign. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I'd comment just briefly on that question. Obviously, interregional transmission would be beneficial to our region in particular. We're at the end of the pipeline, and we have trouble getting adequate amounts of power. We have trouble making it here, and so we might have to rely on outside sources to keep us from being in the dark. But once again, the reliability of the grid isn't just a transmission issue. It's a generation issue. If you don't have dispatchable generation, then it doesn't matter how much transmission you have. You got to have that generation to begin with. If you do have it, then you can bring it into the region via interregional transmission. There's always, it's going to be more expensive though, because there's always line loss when you transport electricity over large distances. So you're going to have to overbuild capacity in order to compensate for those line losses. So it's not a panacea. It is important, but it's not a panacea.
And that kind of helps segue into making the argument for having local sustainable solutions that we can use and dispatch and pair with storage and that sort of thing. We are dealing with a lot of technologies that are foreign to many of us, right? We don't see them in wide adoption in our state. And so we are still having conversations around what the right mix is. But I think the helpful piece would be to understand that if we are shaving peak, if we are building demand response, if we are adopting technologies that allow us to have virtual power plants that can be utilized, those ideas, those concepts can help us to solve the problems that we're talking about. It's really getting to the point where we define what kind of capacities we need to be generating in state in order to avoid having to bring more from out of state, and how much is steady state and how much is required. I think the issues with the transmission lines and also with grid reliability are something that the federal government has been trying to address because they understand that it's a weakness that they wanted to put some funding into. They understand that it's sort of the last thing on the list for most states in terms of having money or wanting to, raise taxes in order to address it. So I feel like we have an excellent opportunity, and that we shouldn't squander that opportunity because we can really make hay while the sun is shining. If we can come up with a plan to say, how are we going to address it to make ourselves more durable in the future? And the last thing I'll say, and it's not necessarily related to just transmission, but we have had a debate back and forth about whether we should even study or look at how carbon pricing will be affecting the country and the state in the future. And the fact is, what carbon pricing attempts to do is to build in some of the costs that we're all going to bear if we don't take action on reducing our carbon emissions. So it's a pay now, pay later kind of scenario, the way I view it. And so I think as a state, we should at least have the information, right? We should be doing something to understand how is this going to affect us, where so many countries are already starting to adopt policies that try to build in those costs that we're all going to bear in terms of the climate disruption that will be coming our way, whether it's flooding or heat or drought or loss of crops. All of those things cost money. And so us detaching our energy policy from an overall understanding that we're not really saving any money by not looking at what's coming our way, I think we have to re-examine that in terms of a balance for how New Hampshire approaches those things.
So mercifully, the air has kicked on here.
Yeah, this is cute. I thought it was the door.
Hi, yes, I'm Friedrichs, and I'm town councilor in Durham. And I wanted to ask around this question of reliability. So I pulled up some reading that I've been doing recently from FERC. And first of all, climate crisis-caused extreme weather is the biggest issue in terms of reliability and stressing our electric grid. So I think when you think about reliability, I first think about that, and we need to get a hold on the climate crisis because any contributions to that are going to just cause bigger problems with reliability in the future. And then I also looked to June reports that came out, one by our local ISO New England when it made the decision to shut down the natural gas plant in Mystic, Connecticut, that was not a good source of reliability for our regional grid. And then there was also a June report put out by FERC at the national level that examined the last 11 grid crises we've seen since 2020, the 11 largest. And the majority of those were actually caused by the failure of natural gas plants because they perform really poorly in extreme cold weather. Yep. And so thinking about all of those things and thinking about as well the legislation that's currently being drafted to establish a committee to look at transitioning the Vose coal station to something else, I want to ask, can we all agree that natural gas is a bad choice for the residents of New Hampshire because it does not increase our reliability and it's not locally produced, and its pricing is going to continue to rise in the future. So we shouldn't be prioritizing a resource that is outside of our local region that will always be an imported resource for us, that has poor reliability, and that is going to worsen our climate costs down the line. Is that something we can all agree on?
I can follow.
Well, I couldn't agree with that. For one thing, natural gas is less expensive because it exists in abundant supplies across much of the country. It's not less expensive here in New England because we don't have the ability to get it here. In addition, natural gas produces fewer carbon emissions than any other source of fuel outside of nuclear and renewable technologies, clean technologies. We rely heavily on natural gas here in New England, and it is the main driver of the cost of our electricity, and is the main driver as a source of our electricity. What are we going to replace it with if we do away with natural gas? We don't have an answer to that question today. Therefore, for the foreseeable future, natural gas is going to be the solution. Now, you said natural gas doesn't perform well in cold weather. Well, natural gas performs fine in cold weather, provided that there's gas. The reason natural gas in New England during cold weather periods, during periods of cold weather, don't perform well is simply because they can't get the gas. The gas is allocated to heating first, and anything that's left over can go to electricity generation. But frequently, if it's cold enough, there isn't very much left over. That's why in New England this past winter, there were a couple of cold snaps where we burned 30 to 40%, or generated 30 to 40% of our electricity by burning oil, which is much more expensive and much dirtier than burning natural gas. So while I agree with you that in a perfect world we'd love to do away with natural gas, our world isn't there yet.
And that's why you have us. Okay, so what I will say is I started paying attention to New Hampshire's energy policy way back in the earlier 2000s. And what I appreciated about the then Office of Energy Planning is that they had a portfolio pie where some new person trying to figure out what the heck was going on in New Hampshire in terms of energy fuel sources was readily available. It was easy to understand. And I think in the year 2000, our gas reliance was about 15%. Today, if you go on the ISO New England at any given time, it's above 60%. And those were choices that were made in New England because we were told that gas was, well, they changed all the nomenclature around gas, right? It was natural, then it was clean. It was cleaner until it was clean. And then, we basically took the low-tar cigarette. But I think our over-reliance on one fuel source, right? We were working at the time that I first started paying attention on diversifying our portfolio so that we were not heavily reliant on any one source, right? So that we had somewhere to go, and that when prices went up, we wouldn't necessarily be all our eggs in one basket. And I think we've been pursuing policies that have said anything that's going to get converted, let's just go with gas because that's the easiest thing. It's a cheap thing. And in the long run, it will not be cheap. So I take your point. And I think we do need to do more planning around what makes sense. I don't think we don't turn off fossil fuels tomorrow. And that is the problem, is that we do need a plan for weaning ourselves off fossil fuels. So I don't have an answer for your specific question. We can talk after the session, but I want to hand it to Senator Waters so he can say what he has to say.
Yeah, I don't know if it's devil's bargain with natural gas, but here we are. And my feeling is that we've got to decarbonize. We just have to. It's how fast we can get there. And, the St. Lawrence part of me says we just got to adapt because we're already screwed in terms of what's going to happen to our climate, and we're going to lose Hampton to sea level rise, most of Portsmouth. I mean, we all know what's going to happen. On the other hand, having to be practical, that's why I've been so interested in green hydrogen. We passed the green hydrogen bill last year. Thank you, Chairman Vose, for your help with that, and Representative McGhee, we got there. And I think that the dual-use turbines that can run on natural gas or hydrogen are potentially the transition that we need. You can already put 20% hydrogen into a blend with natural gas. There is a way to do that right now. And by the late 20s, the estimates are from DOE that the cost of electrolyzing hydrogen will have come down far enough to make that very competitive fuel. And that, by the way, is about when offshore wind comes into New England. So if you have the turbines electrolyzing hydrogen out at the turbine and you compress it and put it onto a ship, you don't have to have pipelines. I think there's a future there for hydrogen that can greatly reduce it. The other way is, I think, heat pumps. Look what Maine's done. They had a goal of 100,000 heat pumps by 2025 or whatever. They've already met it. They're going to 300,000. And that's the technology you can get right to those houses, lower income folks particularly who are on gas or on propane or on oil have no other place to turn. They really just don't. And because, the cost of solar and battery storage, or if you own a triple decker in Manchester, please. But I think the heat pump route, if we could kind of do as Maine is doing and find some ways, maybe it's the Reggie money. I think there are ways to get there, but it's going to be a lot of hard work.
All right, folks, that is the time that we have. So I will release you to lunch. Thank you to our panel of lawmakers for taking the time to come. Thank you for your good questions.